The sun hung low over the dusty town of Redemption Creek on the day everything changed for Clara Whitmore. It was one of those merciless August afternoons when the heat pressed down like a physical weight, making the wooden buildings shimmer in waves of distortion, and even the flies seemed too exhausted to bother with the horses tied along Main Street. The town had gathered in the square, not for celebration, but for something far grimmer, a sheriff's auction where the desperate were displayed like cattle, their fates determined by whoever had coin enough to claim them. Clara stood on the raised platform beside the courthouse steps, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to still them. She wore her mother's blue calico dress, the only nice thing she owned anymore, though it hung loose on her frame after months of rationed meals. Her dark hair had been pinned up that morning with care, a small act of dignity in the face of utter humiliation. Around her neck hung a simple silver locket, the last remnant of better days, and she clutched it now like a talisman against the nightmare unfolding around her. Sheriff Harlan Briggs stood beside her, reading from a legal document in his gravelly voice. The words washed over the crowd: debts owed, property seized, legal obligations, but Clara barely heard them anymore. She had heard it all before, in the lawyer's office 3 weeks ago when they told her that her father's gambling debts had survived his death by 6 months and that the bank now owned everything the Whitmore family had built over 2 generations. The ranch. The cattle. Even the silver tea service her grandmother had brought across the plains in a covered wagon. The crowd below was a mixture of curious onlookers and potential bidders, their faces blurred by the heat and her own tears that she refused to let fall. There were ranchers looking for kitchen help, widowers seeking someone to raise their children, and worse, men whose intentions were written plainly in their leering grins. This was how the territory dealt with unpaid debts when there was no family to shoulder the burden. Indentured servitude, they called it, though the reality was often far darker than the legal term suggested. Clara had tried everything. She had appealed to her father's old friends, only to find that his gambling had burned those bridges long before his horse had thrown him into the ravine. She had sought work in town, but respectable positions were scarce, and the only offers she received came with conditions that made her skin crawl. When the final notice came, she had even considered fleeing into the wilderness, but winter was coming, and a woman alone in the mountains faced dangers worse than any auction block. So here she stood, waiting to learn which man would own her labor for the next 7 years, the term required to satisfy her father's debts. 7 years. She would be 31 when her freedom returned, if she survived that long. The statistics were not encouraging. Indentured servants worked from dawn until long after dark, ate whatever scraps were offered, and had no legal recourse against mistreatment short of death or permanent maiming. Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat and began the bidding. "We'll start at $50 for 7 years of service. Miss Whitmore is educated, can read and write, knows her numbers, and has experience with household management and ranch work." A voice called out from the back. $60. Clara recognized Jacob Thornton, a pig farmer whose wife had run off 2 years ago. The smell of his livestock operation carried on the wind all the way to town. She felt her stomach turn. Another voice. $75. This from Samuel Creed, who owned the saloon and the rooms above it. Clara knew what kind of work he had in mind, and it had nothing to do with washing dishes. The bidding continued, climbing slowly toward $100. Each new voice felt like a nail being driven into her coffin. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the mountains in the distance, trying to imagine herself anywhere but here, anyone but the desperate woman being sold to the highest bidder. Then a new voice cut through the murmuring crowd, deep and clear and utterly commanding. $500. The square fell silent. Even the sheriff paused, his mouth hanging open mid-sentence. $500 was more than most men in the territory earned in a year. It was enough to buy a small ranch outright, complete with stock and equipment. For 7 years of a woman's labor, it was an unthinkable sum. Clara's eyes finally left the mountains and scanned the crowd, searching for the man who had spoken. She found him at the back of the gathering, leaning against a hitching post with the casual ease of someone who owned the very ground he stood on. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that even at this distance seemed to pierce straight through her. He wore black from head to toe, black hat, black shirt, black trousers, black gun belt with a revolver on each hip. Everything about him spoke of danger and barely controlled violence. "That's Jack Donovan," someone near the platform whispered, and the name rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Jack Donovan. Even Clara, who had spent most of her life sheltered on a ranch miles from town, knew that name. The Donovan gang had been terrorizing the territory for 3 years, robbing trains and stagecoaches, rustling cattle, and disappearing into the mountain passes before any posse could catch them. Jack Donovan himself was said to be wanted in 4 territories, with a bounty of $2,000 on his head, dead or alive. Yet here he stood in broad daylight, making a bid at a public auction as though he were any other citizen. Sheriff Briggs had gone pale. His hand drifted toward the gun at his hip, then stopped as he seemed to calculate the odds. Donovan had not come alone. Clara could see them now, scattered through the crowd, 4 other men, all armed, all watching the sheriff with expressions that promised violence if he made the wrong move. The people of Redemption Creek might have wanted to see the outlaw hang, but none of them wanted to die trying to arrest him in the middle of a crowded square. $500, the sheriff repeated, his voice cracking slightly. That's the highest bid. Do I hear 550? The silence stretched out. Nobody dared bid against Jack Donovan. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sheriff Briggs brought his gavel down on the wooden podium with a sharp crack. Sold to Jack Donovan for $500. Donovan pushed away from the hitching post and began walking toward the platform. The crowd parted before him like water before the bow of a ship. Up close, Clara could see the details the distance had hidden, the scar that ran along his left jawline, the faint stubble that shadowed his cheeks, the way his eyes were not quite brown and not quite green but something in between, like creek water reflecting pine trees. He looked to be in his early 30s, though the hardness in those eyes suggested he had lived more than most men twice his age. He mounted the steps to the platform with the fluid grace of a predator and held out a leather pouch to the sheriff. Briggs opened it with shaking fingers, confirming the gold coins inside before nodding and producing the legal papers that would transfer Clara's indenture to her new owner. Donovan signed the papers without reading them, his handwriting surprisingly elegant for a man who made his living with guns. Then he turned to Clara for the first time, and she found herself unable to look away from his gaze. There was something in those eyes that went beyond mere cruelty or kindness, an intensity that suggested he saw far more than what was visible on the surface. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I imagine you have questions." Clara lifted her chin, determined not to show fear even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I imagine you have expectations." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Many. But we'll discuss them on the road. Gather whatever belongings they'll let you take. Everything I own was seized by the bank. Then we leave now." He took her elbow, not roughly but with unmistakable firmness, and guided her down the steps. The crowd remained silent as they walked toward the horses tied at the edge of the square. Donovan's men fell in around them, a protective formation that Clara realized was meant as much to prevent escape as to deter interference. One of the men brought forward a gray mare, already saddled. Donovan helped Clara mount, his hands steady on her waist as he lifted her into position. Then he swung onto his own horse, a massive black stallion that looked as dangerous as its rider. "Ride beside me," Donovan said. "Don't fall behind, and don't try to run. The mountains are unforgiving to those who don't know their secrets, and I promise you that my patience has limits." They rode out of Redemption Creek at a steady pace, neither hurried nor leisurely. Clara glanced back once to see Sheriff Briggs still standing on the platform, the legal papers clutched in his hand, looking like a man who had just made a deal with the devil and was uncertain whether to feel relieved or terrified. The miles passed in silence. The landscape changed gradually from the dusty flatlands around town to the rolling foothills studded with pine and aspen. The air grew cooler as they climbed, and Clara found herself grateful for the respite from the brutal August heat. Around them, Donovan's men rode in practiced formation, their eyes constantly scanning the terrain for threats. These were not simple criminals, Clara realized. They moved with the discipline of soldiers, responding to unspoken signals and covering each other's blind spots with the ease of long practice. After 2 hours of riding, Donovan finally spoke. "You're wondering why?" It was not a question, but Clara answered anyway. "Among other things. $500 is a lot of money for someone you could have simply taken." "I could have. I didn't. There's a difference." Clara studied his profile, trying to understand the man who had just purchased 7 years of her life. "You want gratitude? I want you to understand the terms of our arrangement." He turned to look at her directly, and again Clara felt the weight of that penetrating gaze. "I didn't buy you to cook my meals or mend my clothes, Miss Whitmore. I bought you because you have something I need, and because the alternative was watching you fall into hands that would have destroyed you within a year. And what exactly do I have that an outlaw needs? Legitimacy." The word hung in the air between them. "Your father was Thomas Whitmore, one of the founders of Redemption Creek. Your mother was Elizabeth Harrington, daughter of a federal judge. Your family has been in this territory since before it had a name. That kind of lineage opens doors that all the stolen gold in the world cannot." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You want to use me as some kind of shield. Present me as your wife and suddenly you're not just an outlaw, you're a man with connections, with respectability." "Very quick." Donovan nodded approvingly. "My men and I have been planning something for the better part of a year. Something that will require us to move in circles where a known criminal would be recognized and arrested on sight. But a reformed gunslinger who has married into one of the territory's founding families? That man might be given the benefit of the doubt. That man might be invited to the right parties, introduced to the right people, given access to the right information. What are you planning? That is not your concern. What concerns you is this: you will play the role of my devoted wife. You will smile at the right times, speak the right words, and never, never, give anyone reason to question the authenticity of our arrangement. In exchange, I will ensure your safety, provide for your needs, and when our business is concluded, you will have your freedom and enough gold to start a new life wherever you choose." Clara's mind raced. "And if I refuse?" Donovan's expression hardened. "Then I will return you to Redemption Creek and let Samuel Creed have you for the $75 he bid. I imagine you'll last about 6 months in the rooms above his saloon before drink or disease or violence claims you. I am offering you mercy, Miss Whitmore, but mercy is not the same as softness. It comes with a price, and that price is your complete cooperation." The threat was delivered without heat, which made it all the more terrifying. Clara understood with sudden clarity that Jack Donovan was not a man who made empty promises or idle threats. He had laid out the terms with brutal honesty, and now the choice was hers: become his accomplice in whatever scheme he was planning, or return to a fate that truly was worse than death. "How long?" she asked quietly. 6 months. Perhaps less if things go according to plan. "And after?" "After, you disappear. I'll provide you with a new name, papers, and enough money to establish yourself somewhere far from here. California, perhaps. Or back east if you prefer. Somewhere you can start fresh, free from your father's debts and your family's ruined reputation." Clara looked around at the mountains rising on all sides, at the men riding with them who had probably killed and certainly stolen, at the man beside her who had just purchased her like a piece of property and was now offering her what he called mercy. The choice was no choice at all, really. It was survival, pure and simple. "I'll need time to prepare," she said. "If I'm to convincingly play the role of your wife, I'll need appropriate clothing, knowledge of your background, a coherent story about how we met and married. Donovan's smile returned, warmer this time. We'll have time. Our destination is 3 days' ride from here, a cabin in the high country where we can discuss the details without interruption. By the time we descend to begin our work, you'll know everything you need to know. They rode on as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Clara found her mind spinning with implications and possibilities. She had been saved from one form of servitude only to be pressed into another, but at least this servitude came with an end date and the promise of genuine freedom. Jack Donovan might be an outlaw and a criminal, but he was also clearly an intelligent man with a plan and the resources to execute it. If she could survive 6 months in his company, she might indeed emerge on the other side with a chance at the fresh start she had thought lost forever. As darkness fell, they made camp in a clearing surrounded by ancient pines. Donovan's men moved with efficient precision, building a fire, tending to the horses, and preparing a simple meal of salt pork and beans. Clara was given a bedroll and a place near the fire, and she noted that Donovan positioned himself between her and the other men, a silent but clear statement of protection and possession. After the meal, when the other men had settled down to sleep or keep watch, Donovan came to sit beside her. The firelight played across his features, softening the hard edges slightly. "You're afraid," he said quietly. "That's good. Fear will keep you alert and cautious. But understand this, I keep my word, Miss Whitmore. If you uphold your end of our bargain, I will uphold mine. You'll come to no harm from me or my men. Why should I believe you? Because I have no reason to lie. I could have taken you into the wilderness and done whatever I pleased. Instead, I paid $500 in gold for the legal right to your service. That kind of investment demands protection. You're worth more to me safe and cooperative than damaged or dead." Clara studied his face in the flickering light. "Who are you really, Jack Donovan? Not the legend, not the wanted poster. Who is the man underneath?" For a long moment, he was silent. Then he said, "I'm someone who learned young that the world doesn't care about justice or fairness. It cares about power and the will to use it. I'm someone who decided to take what I needed rather than beg for scraps from men who got rich on the backs of others. And I'm someone who has one chance to set things right, not just for myself but for people who deserve better than what this territory has given them." "You make yourself sound noble." "I'm not noble. I'm necessary." He stood, looking down at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Get some rest, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow we climb higher, and the trail gets harder from here." He walked away to take his turn at watch, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and the crackling fire. She lay down on the bedroll, staring up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the mountain darkness. Everything she had known was gone, her home, her family's reputation, her freedom. In their place was this strange bargain with a dangerous man, this promise of mercy that came with conditions and threats. But as she drifted toward sleep, Clara found herself thinking not about what she had lost but about what might lie ahead. 6 months of playing a role, of pretending to be someone she was not, of helping an outlaw accomplish whatever mysterious goal had driven him to spend $500 on a woman at a sheriff's auction. 6 months, and then freedom. Real freedom, not the illusion her father's ranch had provided before his death revealed the debts and lies underneath. She could survive 6 months. She had survived worse already. And perhaps, in the process, she would discover what it meant to have mercy offered by someone who understood its true price. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They broke camp quickly and continued their ascent into the mountains. The terrain grew rougher, the trees denser, the air thinner. Clara's thighs ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she refused to complain or show weakness. Donovan watched her with what might have been approval, offering water and brief rests but pushing them steadily forward. On the second day, they encountered another group of riders, rough-looking men who eyed Donovan's party with clear hostility until they recognized who they were facing. Words were exchanged, too quiet for Clara to hear, and then the other group rode off without incident. It was a reminder that even in the wilderness, Jack Donovan's reputation preceded him. By the afternoon of the third day, they reached their destination. The cabin sat in a high meadow surrounded by peaks that still held snow in their highest reaches. It was larger than Clara had expected, well-built and sturdy, with glass windows and a stone chimney. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was already in residence. As they dismounted, a woman emerged from the cabin. She was older than Clara, perhaps 40, with graying blonde hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent years in hard conditions. She greeted Donovan with easy familiarity, calling him Jack and accepting his embrace with the warmth of old friendship. "This is Margaret," Donovan told Clara. "She'll help you prepare for your role." Margaret was a stage actress before she came west. "She understands what we need." Margaret looked Clara up and down with a critical but not unkind eye. "Come inside, dear. We have a great deal of work to do, and not as much time as I would like." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable, with real furniture and curtains and even a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. Margaret showed Clara to a small bedroom at the back and produced a trunk filled with dresses, undergarments, shoes, and accessories, everything a woman of means would be expected to own. Jack explained the situation, Margaret said as she began sorting through the clothes. "You're to be his wife, married secretly a few months ago, now emerging into society as a respectable couple. Your father's death and the loss of your property give the perfect cover story. Jack swept in as your savior, married you to preserve your honor, and is now working to rebuild your family's fortune through legitimate business ventures. And people will believe this? They'll want to believe it. Society loves a redemption story, especially when it involves a beautiful young woman and a reformed bad man. We just need to make sure you can play the part convincingly." Over the following days, Margaret transformed Clara. She taught her how to move with the confidence of a woman secure in her position, how to make small talk about nothing while gathering useful information, how to read people's intentions from their body language and tone. They practiced different scenarios, meeting potential business partners, attending social gatherings, deflecting uncomfortable questions about the hasty marriage. Donovan was present for many of these sessions, sometimes playing the role of the person Clara was meant to deceive, sometimes simply observing and offering corrections. Clara found herself grudgingly impressed by his attention to detail and his understanding of human psychology. He seemed to know instinctively which lies would be believed and which would raise suspicion. In the evenings, after Margaret had retired, Donovan and Clara would sit by the fire and he would tell her carefully edited versions of his past. She learned that he had grown up in this territory, the son of a failed prospector who drank himself to death after watching a mining company steal his claim through legal manipulation. She learned that Donovan had tried to work within the system, seeking justice through the courts, only to discover that justice was a commodity sold to the highest bidder. "So you became what you are," Clara said one evening. "I became what they made me." Donovan stared into the flames. "The mining company that destroyed my father also destroyed a dozen other families. They bought judges, bribed sheriffs, and used legal technicalities to steal claims from men who had worked them for years. When I started robbing their payroll shipments, I thought of it as taking back what they had stolen. The law called it theft. I called it justice. And now? Now I have one chance to bring them down properly. Not with guns and robberies, but by destroying them from within. That's why I need you, Miss Whitmore. That's why I need legitimacy and access. Because burning down their offices or robbing their trains only makes them stronger. But exposing their corruption to the right people, providing evidence to federal authorities who aren't on their payroll, that could actually change things." Clara felt something shift inside her. The man she had thought of as simply a criminal was revealing himself to be something more complex, a vigilante with a code, perhaps, or a man so wounded by injustice that he had dedicated his life to fighting back against it. She still did not trust him fully, but she was beginning to understand him. "Tell me about the people we'll be meeting," she said. "Tell me who they are and why they matter." Donovan smiled, and for the first time Clara saw genuine warmth in the expression. "Now you're thinking like a partner instead of a prisoner." He spent the next hour describing the web of corruption that had taken root in the territory, the judges and politicians and businessmen who had enriched themselves at the expense of ordinary people. He explained how mining companies had used their wealth to control every aspect of territorial government, how they had crushed unions and silenced whistleblowers, how they had built an empire on stolen labor and broken promises. As Clara listened, she began to see the outline of Donovan's plan. He intended to infiltrate the highest levels of territorial society, gather evidence of the corruption, and then use his outlaw reputation as insurance. If anything happened to him or his associates, certain documents would be released to newspapers back east where the mining interests held less power. It was audacious and dangerous and possibly brilliant. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. "You said I didn't need to know the details." "Because I've watched you these past few days, and I've realized something. You're smarter than I gave you credit for, and you have a streak of steel underneath that refined exterior. Your father might have been a fool and a drunk, but you're neither of those things. If we're going to succeed, I need you to be more than just a pretty face on my arm. I need you to be a true partner in this endeavor." Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest, something that might have been pride or might have been fear or might have been both at once. Partners implies equality. "I'm still your indentured servant, bought and paid for." "Legally, yes. Practically, that changes now." Donovan leaned forward, his eyes intense in the firelight. "I'll make you a new offer, Clara. Help me accomplish what I've set out to do, use that sharp mind of yours to help me navigate society and gather the evidence I need, and I'll do more than just give you your freedom. I'll give you a share of what we recover. There's money, a great deal of money, that these companies stole from people who had no way to fight back. When we bring them down, that money will need to go somewhere. Half of your father's original stake in the mining operation that was stolen from him 40 years ago, that could be yours. Enough to buy back your ranch and restore your family's name." It was a tempting offer, dangerous and probably illegal but tempting nonetheless. Clara thought about her father, drinking himself to death over debts he could never repay, over a legacy lost.